Welcome back to Alaska Cabin Adventures. Today I'm setting off to build a tiny cabin on wheels. Some might call it a tiny home, but it's not that. It's going to be a tiny cabin just on wheels. Something that I can take with me across the Alaskan countryside with a cozy home base to go back into. When it's -20 or -30, I'll have the wood stove and a warm bed set up and ready to go. If you guys are wondering what I'm doing in a neighborhood building this cabin rather than out in the wilderness in my usual cabin, you probably missed my last video. But don't worry, we will be back out at the cabin by the end of the summer. Little did I know I'd run into way more problems building this thing than I've ever ran into with any of the cabins I've ever done anchored to the ground. So sit back, relax, and let's build a cabin on wheels. The first order of business was finding a trailer that would fit my needs. I decided to go with this deck-over trailer that measures 16 by 8 and it has two 3,500-pound axles on it. Now keep in mind, even though it has 7,000 pounds of axle weight, that doesn't include the weight of the trailer itself. So the trailer usually eats up at least 1,000 to 1,500 pounds of steel, and that comes out of your 7,000-pound payload. So the leftover weight for building a cabin is about 5,500 pounds, if I'm being kind of conservative. But you also don't want to be driving around with the payload of your trailer completely maxed out. So I'm going to try to keep this cabin well under the 5,500-pound mark. If you're using one of these grinders to cut through solid steel, you're definitely going to want to have quite a few blades on hand. It really does chew them up quick.
What's he doing?
Ready to build a cabin, Norm? Once I had the rails off, I switched to a thicker grinding blade. That way the metal was down flush with the rest of the rails. Next up was getting this thing leveled out. Of course, keep in mind that I've never built anything like this before. I mean, sure, I've built a few cabins and small sheds and structures, but nothing on an actual trailer, which not only makes everything a little bit more complicated, but I'm also sort of back to square one with not really knowing what I'm doing. But I figure there's only one real way to learn how to do anything, and that's to just do it. But I'll admit it's been a steep learning curve. As you guys will see here in just a few minutes, I made some pretty major mistakes that almost cost me the entire project. But luckily I've overcome them so far, and I just sort of rolled with the punches. One of the biggest differences about building on a trailer instead of building on the ground is that it's got a flexible axle and squishy tires, so everything's always wanting to shift and change on you, even just walking around the deck of the trailer. When I was disconnecting the trailer from the truck, I happened to look down at the coupler and noticed that it was only rated to 5,000 pounds. So clearly at some point this trailer had been hodgepodged together by somebody, and I looked up underneath it and realized that the deck was totally different from the axles. Luckily the axles were brand new and are 3,500 pounds, but with a coupler rating of only 5,000 pounds, that just means I lost 2,000 pounds of payload on this trailer. That only leaves me 3,500 pounds to build a cabin with. I decided I'd try to get this cabin as light as I could by removing every other deck board on the top of the trailer. Of course, I immediately ran into a problem when I realized that the carriage bolts were basically just stripped inside the wood, so there was no way to remove them. So instead I was just going to have to take the Sawzall and cut all these boards out myself. And this is the moment that I realized I had a pretty serious problem on my hands. As you can see, the 2x4 doesn't sit flush on top of the deck boards at all. In fact, it bows down pretty significantly in the center, leaving about an inch gap. Not only was the center of the trailer sagging, but I realized that the side rails weren't level either. They kind of bowed up in some places and sloped down in other places. I realized that this whole trailer was just kind of out of whack, and I was going to have to figure out some way to fill in all the gaps and cracks in order to have a level building surface to start on. I kind of figured I'd just build the floor, and that way I could see exactly where the gaps and cracks were and figure out a way to fill them in. And of course, the very first nail that I drove split the 2x4. I was pretty upset about that, considering I spent a little extra money on the premium studs, so I decided I was going to have to pre-drill and screw in every single corner of this entire cabin. Another big difference with building on a trailer rather than on a normal foundation is that you really want to anchor everything down the best that you can. You're going to be driving down the road with this thing at 60 miles, maybe even 70 miles an hour, plus the wind coming at it could be over 100 mile an hour sustained winds. It's essentially like a hurricane at all times that this thing's traveling. So I wanted to bolt the actual floor down to the steel of the trailer to make sure it wasn't going to go anywhere. Of course, as soon as I did that, I ran into another problem. With the outline of the floor built and all my holes pre-drilled for later bolting down, it was time to try to level this thing out by using a 1-inch piece of foam. I thought if I put the foam down and then put carriage bolts through the floor, I could crank it down really tight on the areas that I needed to absorb a little bit of room between the deck and the floor. And of course, having more insulation in your floor is never a bad thing, especially one that goes underneath the floor joist, so that way it'll really cut down on the thermal bridging effect. By the way, you never want to do exactly what it is that I'm doing right here. You don't want to actually hold on to the stud that you're shooting a nail into, just in case the nail jumps out and comes and bites your hand, especially without a glove on. If you are holding onto a stud while you shoot a nail into it, at least make sure that your hand is far enough back that if it does shoot through the wood, it's not going to get you. And I also realized that I picked a really stupid place to put my carriage bolt. Stupid. In my previous build videos, I still made lots of mistakes, but I never really took the time to film them or include them in the videos. I didn't really think it was necessary, but the more I do this, the more I think it's important for people to see the struggles and mistakes that I do make, so you guys can learn from them, and also not to get discouraged when you do run into problems yourself. I do want to take a second to mention that all the music in my videos is original. It's written and recorded by me and my buddy Forrest Wilson out at the cabin, and I have it up for download on my website at alaskacabinadventures.com. In addition to the 6 carriage bolts that I put up and down along the edges of the frame, I also put 2 of these Timberlock screws in every single one of the floor joists. I did not want this thing blowing off in the wind. One of the biggest problems about working with foam board insulation is that when you cut it, it makes a huge mess. It sends bits of foam flying everywhere and it looks like you're inside of a snow globe and leaves the area messy for a long time. Well, I finally figured out a trick by just taking my jigsaw blade and flipping it around backwards so that the back of the jigsaw was actually doing the cutting rather than the saw blade. And man, it made a huge difference. Since the floor is framed out with 2x4s, that means 3.5 inches of depth that I can fit insulation into. I wanted to have these things completely packed full because having a warm floor makes the whole cabin much warmer. While I wasn't able to find 3.5 inch foam insulation, I was able to find 2 inch and then 1.5 inch boards. So I just bought the 2 inch, the 1.5 inch, cut them down and stuck them together in order to fill the entire cavity of the floor joists. The key to building a really strong floor that's never going to squeak on you is gluing around the edges and screwing it down. So I use this liquid nail wood glue along all the edges of the joist. I also undersized all my foam by about 1 inch on all sides so that I could add an expanding foam into the cracks. That way this stuff would really lock in and create an airtight seal around the entire thing. In an effort to cut down on as much weight as possible, I framed the floor at 24 inches on center and I used a 3/8 plywood instead of your usual 3/4 inch plywood for the decking. I gotta say, I was pretty nervous that I'd have a flexi floor, and sure enough, it was more flexi than I wanted it to be. But the rigid foam in between definitely helps bridge the gaps, so I really don't think it'll be a problem once I put the 1/4 inch flooring in on top of this. With the 1-inch foam underneath and then the 2-inch and 1.5-inch pieces filling the voids, I figured out that the R value would be about R20 all told for the floor. Not too shabby for a little tiny cabin. Now that I finally had a level floor that was securely bolted down to the trailer frame, all insulated and ready to go, it was finally time to start doing something I knew how to do, which was build some walls. I debated for a really long time about what size lumber to use for wall framing. Initially I was going to try to use 2x3s to save weight, but in the end I ended up going with 2x4s. The 2x3s only come in 8-foot lengths, and I was going to need some longer pieces to make ridge boards. The other thing about 2x3s is that they're really crappy pieces of lumber, and finding straight true ones is a real pain in the butt, especially when you're trying to buy 40 or 50 of them for a cabin. By the way, did I mention how much I hate using Phillips head screws? They are by far the worst bit. They always slip and strip out. They're really a terrible option. I much prefer a torque bit like a T25 or a square bit or pretty much anything besides the Phillips, I guess with the exception of a flathead. The only reason I'm using these Phillips heads is because I had a couple of boxes left over and I didn't want to waste them before I got into my T25 screws. Since I didn't use tongue and groove for the subfloor decking, I left about an 1/8 inch gap between each piece of plywood to account for any expansion that the plywood might do as moisture hit it. However, this leaves a little bit of an overhang at the end of the cabin that I wanted to cut off before I got started on the walls. The maximum height for a trailer that's legally allowed to be on the road is 13.5 feet. While I'm going to come way in under that given my whole setup, I didn't want to come anywhere near that point, so I decided to go with 6-foot walls to give the cabin a little bit shorter look and make sure that I was going to make it under any of the bridges that I might come across along the road. The biggest rough opening that I have for windows and doors on this cabin was only going to be about 4 feet, so I built a 2x6 header out of a couple of 2x6s, a 1/2 inch piece of plywood, glue, and some screws. All right. On the last wall, I decided to get lazy and not pre-drill and screw my corner pieces. And sure enough, those things split right on open. And yet I made another stupid mistake when I went to nail the walls down to the floor. By the time you start nailing down your double top plates, the walls really start to firm up, and you get a good feel for how things are going to look inside. If you notice, I didn't build the cabin over the entirety of the 16-foot trailer. That's because I wanted a 4-foot porch to overhang the back of it, so that I had somewhere to sit and store firewood and give it a nice cabin look. So the total dimensions of the actual cabin are only going to be a 12 by 8, even though the trailer is a 16-foot. With rain coming up in the forecast, I really wanted to get a tarp over the top of this thing so I didn't have to worry about it getting wet. So I put this temporary blocking up so I could put my ridge beam in just to have enough of a pitch to tarp it so the rain would run off to the sides rather than pooling up in the middle. Well, that was pretty stupid. It was time to work a little smarter rather than harder. I'll admit I really miss being out at my cabin doing a project like this, but I feel fortunate that I'm able to work on this while I am in town. I really appreciate you guys watching all the way to this point in the video. The next couple episodes are going to get really interesting because it's going to start to get into some uncharted territory for me.
Alright.
Don't forget to check out my website at alaskacabinadventures.com. You guys can download the music, get yourself some merch, or donate to the channel if you're feeling generous. Thanks again.